I don't know. I mean, reading the book, I get the sense that the both of you, and I know this is true for Ryan and I never had that phase in my life where I wanted to, move out to Hollywood or move to New York to be a star. But I have always wanted to say live from New York, it's Saturday night. So do we want to go ahead and say live from New York, it's Saturday night?
Yes.
Sure.
Awesome.
Live
Live
from
Live
from New
New
from New
York.
York,
York.
It's
it's
Saturday
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 night.
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 It's the History on Film podcast with Ross Lennon, Ryan Barr, Steven Ginsberg, Steven Tropiano, and your host, Steve Martin. Wait, I mean, Ross and Ryan. Hello, and welcome to another interview edition of the History on Film podcast. I'm your host, Ross Lennon. I'm joined, as always, by my close friend and colleague, Ryan Barr. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited about, I mean, I say this every episode, but I feel like, we do episodes where I know other people get something out of it and enjoy it, but I'm really doing the podcast that I want to listen to a lot with topics. And this is another topic that's just near and dear to my heart. It's kind of like, when we talk about Godzilla and we talk about anime and we talk about Mr. Science Theater, this is just another one of those things that it's part of the tapestry that makes kind of you know, my sense of humor, my sense of being, sprinkle in Office Space, and you kind of got the Mount Rushmore of like my comedic
Yeah,
background. So
it's
this is going to be a fun. This is going to be a fun one.
yeah, it's a part of the melange that made you and I such weird kids and such interesting adults. Um,
Exactly.
but we have two great guests with us today. We have Steven Ginsberg and Steven Tropiano joining us to talk about Saturday Night Live, the 50th anniversary special just aired about a week before we recorded this.
Yep.
They have a book out all about SNL. So thank you so much for joining us, Steven and Steven.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourselves and a little bit about your book.
I can start. So I'm a professor of screen studies out here in Los Angeles for Ithaca College, which is actually in New York. They send students here to take classes and do internships in the industry. And then in addition to that, I write books. And I've watched Saturday Night Live since it started. Actually, I watched the first episode when it aired back in 1975. Mr. Ginsberg?
Okay, so I'm Steve Ginsberg. Yes, we're both named Steve, and I teach TV writing and screenwriting, film writing. You can't say screenwriting anymore because everything's on a screen. And at Ithaca College also, we and just for the record, we are married. We've been in a relationship for 37 years. And we just joke about the idea that we both attended a taping of Saturday Night Live. Me in the first year, what Steve, was it you in the second year or third year? I can't remember.
Second and third. Second and third or third and fourth, one of those.
Yeah. And I started as a screenwriter, and then I started teaching, and now I do both. And we actually met the first time we met, first date, whatever you want to call it, was towards the end of it. We actually watched Saturday Night Live. It was Sean Penn hosting Saturday Night Live. So Saturday Night Live has been this weird occurrence in our lives for decades, years and years and years. So
Yeah, I love how much at the very start of your book, you talk about how much the show means to the both of you. And it was really cool getting that personal connection right up front. It really, I really like that part of it. So that was a great way to lead into something that, has become such an institution for good or bad. It was so nice to start with that, personal touch to it.
And also I think that thank you. And I think that it is not uncommon for people to feel that way about the show. I mean, depending on, obviously not everybody's met, and watch Saturday Night Live together. But I think that part of it is that a lot of people have a personal connection over the decades to the show. Depending on whether you watch it when you were in school, whether you watch it with your parents. A lot of our students now watch it with their parents, or you don't watch it with your parents, which was the case back in the 70s. It was like this kind of, ooh, I'm cool. I get to watch SNL, and my parents are asleep in the other room. And so that is, I think, part of what keeps the show going, among a lot of other things. What do you think, Steve?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, because it's so rare that a show has been on for so long that it becomes like a bit of a marker in your life. People always ask, like, who's your favorite cast? I can't even remember who is cast member when. I have like a general idea after the first five, and I guess the sixth. It all becomes kind of a little bit muddled because it's been on for so long, and there's been so many cast changes and cast members over that period of time.
Yeah, and it's kind of a cliche or, like sort of like a hobby horse, but you'll always hear people say like people's favorite version of SNL is whatever they watched when they were 12. And that's,
Right.
sort of like a rule of thumb that for a lot of people, just happens to work out. But it is so interesting that for multiple generations, it's like, oh, well, it was Will Ferrell, it was whoever, it was, so it's like it is interesting that it has that personal connection, even though your first interaction with it was, several years before my first interaction with it, and vice versa. So,
And one of the things you write in the book is, I think it's sort of one of the secret sauce things about the show is that because it has a revolving cast, everybody has it, there's certain things that stayed the same, but like any show, it evolves, right? But because it has a cast that changes, the show kind of reinvents itself, even though it sort of stays the same. So there's a timeliness about it, depending on who the cast is for that younger generation, and you can kind of see, so the older you get, you can kind of see there's certain changes that get made. There's certain jokes that are not really jokes that you would probably make, but yet there's things that are funny to everybody. So
Yeah, I think that's what, for me, that's what makes the show so great, is because you do have these different casts and it does evolve with time. And it's kind of like, I think of Ross and I are big Rush fans, right? And Rush is one of those bands where they are not protective of what Rush is, right? They're always influenced by what they're listening to and what's popular in music. So like in the 80s, there's a lot of ska and hip hop and reggae and dancehall being influenced to Rush. And you can see the same thing with SNL because it's been around just as long, 50 years, as the band Rush. And every cast, every 5 years or 10 years or so, when the cast does a changeover, and I know in recent years it's more quickly, you do see those reflective changes in society and comedy and what's acceptable, what isn't. What some of the jokes they make now in 2025, they might not have been able to do in 1975 with the censors. But also, I think now with like the current cast, you have Bone Yang, Ashley Padilla, Marcelo Hernandez. It's they're finally embracing both queer and persons of color as that tapestry and tapping to those type of history thing where maybe even 10 years ago, definitely 20 years ago when I started watching it, they weren't doing. And of course that changes the dynamic, changes the jokes, and I think that keeps it fresh and relevant. That you can point to any era, and we'll talk about this later especially about political history. You can point to any era and say, oh, well, that's what's going on right now in America based on what they're doing on SNL.
well, yeah, and that was one of the things we found doing the book, is that it really is this touchstone and time capsule of the country, especially the political stuff, but not only the political stuff. If you look at the music, you look at pretty much anything about it, you can really, oh my God, That's right. That happened then. And yeah, it's a strange it's almost like a kaleidoscope, like you're looking at it, but you're not quite looking at it. And it's kind of that's what's kind of great about it, I think, too. That it's selective, but yet there are these touchstones that most people remember. So
So we always start at the very beginning. So what is Saturday Night Live?
Well, that's kind of the question they ask in the movie, right? In the film about what it actually is.
Mhm.
And I think they actually got it right. Um, in the idea that having a place to go to on Saturday night and to feel like you're actually in New York. And that's what they were kind of bringing to. Um, you know, the the show at the time was very unique because it was live, which we didn't really have a lot of live TV unless it was like, news and sports or, special events. And so, and particularly when you were at a certain age, as well, particularly I think when you're in your teens and in your 20s, and you didn't live in New York City, but you kind of felt like this show was going on in New York City, live, and we both grew up in New York, so we did see it live when it was first on the air until we moved to the West Coast, and now we actually see it live again. The format of the show, the original format of the show, what you see in the first episode isn't really what they would adhere to. They actually started integrating the hosts with the guests and so on. I mean, in the very beginning, if you had to describe it to somebody who had never seen it, I guess you would think of it as a variety show, because that's sort of where even Laura Michaels sort of comes from. But it's not a traditional variety show by any means. I mean, I always think of variety shows in the 70s as like, Sonny and Cher and the Dean Martin show, and, that have this very sort of like, they do sketches and musical guests, and they still do that. But what was different about it was actually speaking to an entire different audience. And we talk about narrow casting now as TV shows actually don't have to go for the big wide audience. And this is an example of a network show, an early network show that actually wasn't doing that, that actually was going towards a specific demographic of young people, which they didn't really think about so much in the 70s about that sort of narrow casting towards young people.
And I think of it, and I wrote this I think in one of the introductions to the book. I felt like it was like getting to hang out with the cool kids because I was not a cool kid in school at all. And I remember because it make me sound like I'm 110, but I remember when the show went on the air. I was home on a lot of Saturday nights, and there was just something cool about it. I'm sure that's not what younger people think now, but it felt like there wasn't anything like it on television. It was dangerous because, from what Steve's saying, there weren't that many live shows. It was strange, even the opening was strange. I think the thing with the Wolverines and all that it was just off, but it was off enough where you kind of got it. And then it had people, even from the first show, like George Carlin, who, even though he wasn't in his 20s when he hosted the show, he was very representative of what was going on at the time. And so it set this tone for the show. And I think that's kind of continued in a slightly different way all through the generations. They touch on things that other shows just pretty much wouldn't touch on. I mean, now that's not entirely true because all kinds of shows touch on all kinds of things, but that I think that stayed consistent. Not in every episode, but every so often they'll go there and you think, oh my God, really? Oh wow, that's oh my God, I can't believe they did that. That kind of thing.
I think that sort of sense of, this new and sort of like very obscure or niche kind of thing. I do think that for Ryan and I's generation, that was Adult Swim on Cartoon Network. This very subversive, avant-garde sort of stuff that you just felt like, you were watching something that should not exist in the rest of your world. But yeah, definitely, I do think that that sort of stuff perpetuates throughout.
Yeah, and it's like, how does this exist? How would they let
Mhm.
it in the air, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, even recently they did that the Oedipal arrangements thing, and I was like sitting there like, I can't believe they got away with this, like, and the fact they had explained like the story of Oedipus in it, because obviously not everyone's going to be up on their Greek tragedies. But I was sitting there watching it, I was laughing my ass off. I showed it to my mom, and she did not. She was like, "This is not funny." I'm like, "But it is. Like, if you're a millennial that's terminally online, it is very funny."
you see, like that is the perfect encapsulation of it, that your parents
Right.
won't get it. Like that makes it even better for people
Right.
that the parents won't understand it.
And my mom is a kid of the 70s. She like, I grew up before I even started watching SNL. Like her and my dad would be quoting stuff from the 70s from SNL when we were kids in the 90s. My dad loved King Tut and would sing. He just walk around the house humming King Tut, or be cooking dinner singing King Tut. My dad, he loved the Born in Arizona, Moved to Babylonia line. That was his favorite thing.
Hmm.
So 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 sometimes I'm like I'll like share a clip with like my mom, and I'm like, and she's like, yeah, I don't get it, and then there's things that she finds funny from SNL. I'm like, that's so pedestrian, that's definitely the some neo-lib 70s kid stuff.
And well,
you
and
know
sometimes Stephen, and it's funny when you would say that because we'll watch it now and we'll go, I don't get that. That's not
yeah,
funny. Start thinking, oh no, you got him
right,
Yeah,
talk.
and then there are students who are obviously younger than you are,
right.
who I think they think of the show a little bit as like your parents' comedy show.
Hmm.
I guess we're their parents' age by now, or
Yeah.
grandparents' age.
Yeah,
But the idea that they don't find things funny, um,
right,
as well, that they think of that like as the like I said, is it's like the kind of show their mom and dad would watch now,
right,
but they wouldn't necessarily watch. But I would say the difference though is that they watch clips of it,
That's right.
which is the big thing that has changed, a lot with YouTube. So they don't have to sit through the whole show, but they'll watch
right.
maybe the opening or, especially now, even a lot that's written about the show talks about what happened last night, and it'll be like a sketch or something, and they'll
Right.
end up watching that.
And the videos they'll watch but they'll still, like, it's funny with the anniversary shows, some of our students were talking about it, and a lot of them, not
A lot of
all.
mine, a lot of mine watched it. I asked them.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
love they a lot of them watched the anniversary show and really liked it. So I think that's true. They'll watch it in clips, but they don't watch anything really live. So, it's what this is
Right.
no different.
Dancing by the Nile. Disco. The ladies love this style. Boss rockin' for a mile. He ate a crocodile. He gave his life for tourism.
And so, what is sort of the origin story for Saturday Night Live? You can't tell the story without, talking about Lorne Michaels. But, where did this come from, in sort of its earliest kind of days?
Well, in its earliest days, and some of this is actually in the film, is there was a contractual dispute with Johnny Carson, who from what I read didn't want to be on 6 nights a week, because they used to show like reruns of Carson on Saturday night. And so, in order to sort of settle things with Johnny Carson, they came up with the idea of actually doing some sort of show on Saturday night. And so this executive, named Herb Schlosser, who a lot of people had really liked, was one of the good guys at NBC. Sort of listed Dick Ebersol to create the show, and they recruited Lorne Michaels, who was young and who wrote comedy. He actually wrote things like Laugh-In. He comes from a, sort of a comedy background and a performer background as well. So they came up with the idea for a show, and I think I was able to publish because actually Herb Strasser gave me the original outline of what would be in the show. And they were trying to differentiate it from not being like, the Milton Berle show, of not being like a sort of standard variety show. So they came up with this idea of doing this, and I think originally they were going to have like three hosts that rotated, which was something that had been done before on network variety shows. So it was going to be George Carlin, Richard Pryor, and Lily Tomlin, who all hosted eventually. And so they sort of just came out with this sort of kind of bit of a ragtag format. It wasn't really sort of in stone or anything. So the idea was that they were going to put the show on the air instead of Johnny Carson on Saturday night. And so Lorne Michaels was the one who recruited all the people in terms of the talent, as they did all these auditions, the talent, and also writers, and became really kind of the creator and the showrunner of the show.
And also, what's interesting when you look at the people who were doing the show in the beginning, they obviously people from National Lampoon and also from Second City, but then also, what I found in some of the political stuff is there was a limited amount of shows that were doing things related to politics or contemporary pop culture. But then you look at Lorne Michaels was on Laugh-In, which was doing relevant stuff. Steve Martin wrote won an Emmy actually as part of the writing team of the Smothers Brothers. Buck Henry, who did a lot of the stuff in the beginning, wrote, I think, for That Was the Week That Was, if I'm not mistaken. So there were roots in some stuff that was already on TV, or cutting edge, not necessarily on TV, but in the theater or whatever. And it all kind of came together in this, like what Steve was saying, this kind of ragtag sort of way.
Yeah, and we'll kind of touch on it again when we get to, because I want to talk about like just the show, like whether it is a quote political show or not. But it's so interesting that it has this direct connection to Laugh-In and the Smothers Brothers, shows that have been off the air for a very long time. But it's like they persist in this show's DNA in a very, interesting sort of way.
Yeah.
And there's some Python in there too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Although I would argue not enough. I think SNL, they've always had a hard time like ending a skit well. And I think if they could just commit to the Python bit of like, well, we're not ending it, or like, well, now this character is going to walk over here and be in this sketch or something, be a little bit more avant-garde and sort of like, fixing the thing that they've struggled with for 50 years. I always thought that would be my one quick fix if they let me into the writer's room.
It was funny because I don't remember when SCTV, from Canada was on, but I just remember thinking sometimes I'd watch an SCTV skit. When was that, on the 70s or 80s, Steve? I can't remember, but
70s, late 70s.
Yeah, 70s. Yeah. So that was the closest to SNL, but I remember they would do like Python-esque things, not cutting edge like that, but they would do like John Candy at the Community Theater, Peter Pan, playing Peter Pan, and these strange things. And I remember thinking, oh, they should do more of that, on SNL.
I think what they got from like Monty Python was doing studio stuff in film segments, and the film segments on Monty Python were bridges a lot of times, or these repetitive things that you would see. And SCTV had the unification, everything was sort of unified because it was supposed to be a TV station. So they could just sort of insert things whenever they wanted, and so on. But I agree with you that SNL always had this trouble with how to end, a sketch, or even to have an ending to a sketch. And it's still a trouble. It's still a problem.
But if you go to sketch comedy in when you go to like out here, I haven't been in a while, but the Groundlings or any of that, a lot of times in sketch comedy, that is part of sketch comedy where they don't know how to end it,
Or
just
improv,
Yeah.
which is
yeah,
a
improv.
lot of
Yeah,
people's
that's
background.
better. Yeah, you're right. Improv more.
Well, and I think, one of the things that made this show so successful is that they really nail, I mean, I've always kind of thought of the show, and this is certainly not a novel thought on my end, but it's like it kind of serves as like an incubator or like not a preseason, but like it's sort of like this traditionally this pipeline for comedy in America. Like, like on the way up, and so many iconic people are involved in those early casts. So it's like I don't know that, I doubt that they were sort of thinking that as it happened, but it's like, you know, what are your thoughts on SNL as like this incubator, or like this, training program uh, for comedy in America?
Well, one thing that it did from the very beginning is to recruit new people that people had never seen before. And I think that in some ways that kind of kept the show fresh. Occasionally, and there was even that one season, I think it was season 11, where they, got Randy Quaid, they got Joan Cusack, they got people, then there was like Billy Crystal and Martin Short, people that were sort of known. But the idea of kind of making it completely fresh faces, I think that actually helped boost the show. And of course, then what happens is when somebody is kind of a breakout cast member, then they become sort of the star, so to speak. That becomes the reason why people watch the show is because of certain people on. But I think we both agree with you that the number of people whose careers got launched as a result of the show, I mean, is sort of unprecedented for anything that was ever on television.
Well, originally when we were writing the book, we were actually going to do a chapter about this, but we didn't want the book to be 2,000 pages. Already it was just going on and on and on. So we put it in the introduction. But you think, Tina Fey, Larry David, Amy Poehler, Jane Curtin, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Conan O'Brien, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Fallon, Bill Hader, Jason Sudeikis, Maya Rudolph, Andy Samberg, Will Forte, all of whom had their own shows on television. That's just the beginning part. It's not all the people that did stand-up and, when Adam Sandler and Eddie Murphy became the two huge movie stars. I mean, you could go on. I mean, I didn't mention dozens and dozens of people, but it's astounding when you look at the list of everybody, starting from the beginning. I mean, Chevy Chase and John Belushi became huge movie stars. Not to mention, it is
Bill Murray.
bizarre. Bill Murray, yeah. Bill Murray, who still.
Yeah. Yeah. And still loved, whereas, Chevy Chase is not as.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's
We'll
reasons.
go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or should we?
We can if we want to. So we're talking about the first episode. We're talking about October 11th, 1975. I know you guys didn't get into it in the book a little bit, but I think the movie that just came out Saturday night kind of shows kind of the chaos and kind of what you guys were saying earlier about asking that question, what is SNL, in the movie kind of try to answer that question. It looks like even at the beginning that Lorne quite didn't know and the cast didn't quite know, and that up until really they went on air, they didn't know. And it's a miracle that it kind of landed the way it did. Ross and I talk about, we talked about in the past about how like Godzilla in 1954, Star Wars 1977, certain things have to land the way they landed, or there wouldn't be Godzilla, there wouldn't be Star Wars, there wouldn't be SNL. And it's, we were watching that movie. It's kind of like watching the Titanic and some other movies. You kind of know how it's going to end, but you're still kind of on the edge of your seat the whole time. Like, oh my God, they're not going to make it. They're not going to land this ship. They are not going to get this on air at time. And, and I think the movie acts as a great historiography of that 90 minutes leading up to, the first episode and kind of the chaos behind the scenes.
Well, when we think of television, we think of things as being so formatted. and so pre-planned. There isn't really like a lot of spontaneity in terms of like entertainment programming. All the spontaneity is from, news really. So the idea that it wasn't all written, it was, the idea that they did this rehearsal and it was like 3 hours long. I mean, everything in television is timed, and it still is. And occasionally we see an episode where, why are they going to a commercial again? Or why are the credits rolling so slowly? Or why is the host saying goodnight? And obviously they're stretching time because some things come in short because you can time a sketch as much as you can, but it can only you can only do that so much, and things happen, and et cetera. So, but for the most part, everything is down to the second. Particularly with a live TV show. So what was unusual about it is they didn't really sort of address that issue to very, very late. And, I just remember with Lord and Michael's character just taking all the cards off the board in frustration because they just simply had too much content as well.
But I think also, one of the things you learn, like when you're a screenwriter, and movies are very scripted, just like TV, but different because there aren't commercials. And, the magic happens, people think, oh, screenwriters hate it when somebody changes a line or changes a word or whatever. And I always tell our students, no, they don't hate it. They hate it when they change a line to something that sucks. But if somebody changes a line to something that's great or it happens in the moment, no screenwriter cares. I don't think most don't, and so that kind of magic of something, of letting something breathe and something happening in the moment, or somebody, we can get into later about the breaking up, that's a whole other subject. But that thing that happens when actors are doing something and it goes just slightly different, it's not really improvisation, but it's kind of riffing off the material, that's where the great stuff happens. And I think Laugh-In had that, Smothers Brothers had that, SNL did that and ran with it. I think a lot of shows do that. And then there's a lot of formatted comedy shows, before there was streaming, that don't do that, and you can kind of feel it after a while. So,
and I think that SNL kind of gives the illusion that it is spontaneous,
right.
Because they're reading off cue cards. I'm sure they made last minute changes. They don't allow people to improvise. That's sort of like kind of the unwritten written rule of the show, but because it's sort of live and because it is sort of it does have that sort of, I think that's part of its appeal, that sort of spontaneity, even though what we're watching isn't really spontaneous, but they make it seem like it is.
Yeah, you want people to think that it's all improvised and
something's going to happen,
Yeah, oh my God. And yeah, some little thing can happen, but no act, this has been going on for generations. No, actors don't go and make up their lines while they're there. They don't. They'll make up a line maybe, or there'll be a pause, or there'll be a thing. But for the most part, no. I guess there's some, Mike Leigh movies are done improvisationally. I mean, there's some exceptions, but really, it's an illusion.
Right. I think when Bill Hader hosted last, he did that in his monologue. It's like, when we mentioned a celebrity and then they come in as a cameo, that's all planned, right? I didn't know that, and honestly, as a kid, because Ross and I are at that age right when it was like the 20th, 25th anniversary cast. So it was like the late 90s Will Ferrell cast, right?
Yeah.
At the same time those were premiering live, they were showing like the cast from about 10 years ago with Mike Myers, Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman. Those were being ran during the day on Comedy Central as reruns. So I was watching those, catching up, and then watching on the week, Saturday, in middle school and high school, the new episodes. And I always remember the episode where it's Mike Myers as Linda Kaufman with Madonna and Roseanne, and then Barbara Streisand shows up, and I thought that was a real, like, oh my God, Barbara Streisand, and they're all freaking out, and you find out, oh yeah, it was all planned. But 12, 13-year-old me was like, oh my God, Barbara Streisand shows up out of nowhere, and it has that effect. You do think it's spontaneous. You do think it is random. You do think they play it well enough that it's sold as being random, spontaneous, even though it's been planned. And
Barbara Streisand probably the least spontaneous performer.
Right.
Well, I think
right.
I was just reading about that. So I think they didn't know whether she was going to come. And I don't know.
I believe, by the way.
Tropiano, correct me if I'm wrong. Did Madonna and Roseanne know that she was
supposedly they didn't know.
Supposedly they didn't know, but
I think Mike Myers knew.
Yeah,
okay.
They were
we actually met Mike Myers at a Barbara Streisand concert.
Yeah.
Because he performed. He came on as Linda Richman. It was like New Year's Eve one year. I don't remember what the year was.
Such a great character.
So I think, I think Barbara Streisand doesn't really do television or cameos. Right. So for her to do that, she obviously had some connection with Mike Myers. But it is possible that the other two didn't know.
Yeah,
right.
But
supposedly she came in and the car brought her to the studio. They walked her upstairs. She went on the stage.
And that was it. Yeah.
This is all she did and said a line. And
And what also just made it funny is that Linda Richman kept referencing for each sketch Barbara Streisand, like the whole thing, so, and it was the perfect thing, right? It was just that moment. I mean, it reminds me of when Steve, I don't know what year it was, but the Beatles were actually supposedly they did a whole thing about the Beatles that Lorne Michaels said he to pay them.
Lorne Michaels offered them a check for $3,000 to reunite.
Yeah,
and it was like a gag. It was in the first season, and just by coincidence, Paul McCartney and John Lennon were together up at the Dakota, where John Lennon lived, and they had thought about getting in a cab and going down there to just make an appearance.
Yeah, they were like,
it would cause too much commotion.
They were really close to doing it, supposedly, like this close to doing it, and then
very close to doing it. But
I just love how Lauren ends that. It's like, if you want to give Ringo less, I understand that part. Just as a big Beatles fan as a kid, I'm still a big Beatles fan, but as someone who was getting into the Beatles and that was getting played on TV again, and especially during the 25th. The retrospectives like VH1, MTV, all the channels were doing their like clip show retrospectives of the show, the history, and then just that ending and being into the Beatles and knowing their history and like, oh, that's funny. And then also Lorne Michaels later on during the same documentary saying like, if they showed up at 30 Rock, they probably wouldn't even been able to get through the door, let alone up into the into the studio, let alone through the front door of NBC headquarters, even being the Beatles.
But we were talking a few days ago, but what was a big thing, like Simon and Garfunkel reunited on SNL. It's really hard for people to appreciate it now. That was like a huge thing. I'm not quite the Beatles, but still pretty up there, so.
Right. And one thing I want to touch on about the movie, which kind of leads us into like the next, it leads us to another section. We don't want to jump ahead 5 years, but one thing I picked up on, and it's definitely reflective in his years at the helm, is that Dick Ebersol never really understood SNL, and that comes across in the movie. It definitely comes across in the years that he was in charge. And we'll leave that for later, but I just want to sprinkle that out there, chum the water a little bit because that's definitely something I picked up on like immediately. And I'm watching the movie and they say, they call him by name, Dick Ebersol. I'm like, oh, it was kind of my initial reaction.
Compared to Lorne Michaels, I mean, he was like a square. Yeah, he was like a preppy, as they would call. He came from a completely different background. He was more of like a suit at NBC, and he was a sports guy. So he
Right.
wasn't like a comedy. He did not come from. In some ways, I always felt a little sorry for him because he did help get the show on the air. I mean, he was the liaison which Laura Michaels needed between the show and the NBC brass, who I always picture as being a group of humorless white men in a room, and so on. And that's why I mentioned that guy Herb Schlosser who gave me the thing because he was actually the person everybody liked. So he was like the good father, in terms of the NBC and the NBC people. But that's changed the as it often does, executives change and the brass changed and so
Also,
on.
Right.
like, do people get it? Which is not necessarily, sometimes it's a generational thing, but sometimes it's not. There's a difference between being a writer on Laugh-In and producing Wide World of Sports, you know? It just isn't, it's not it's not so much a judgment call as it's just taste and sensibility, you know? And sometimes it's connected to how old you are, but then there are people who are younger who don't get SNL, at the time. And, I doubt Donald Trump watched SNL when he was, younger. So,
He's watching now, though.
well, yeah, for different reasons, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's, so it really just depends on who you are as a person, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in to defend Dick Ebersol because as an NFL fan, he was, he did have he has a much better reputation in the football world.
Yeah.
And then also, just to chum the waters with this, the official stance of the History on Film podcast is that the Muppets need to be in much more things in
Yes.
general. Um, I don't love the Muppet stuff on SNL. Certainly not as much as I love the Muppet Show, which was a contemporary. But I just wanted to put it out there that, we are staunch advocates for Muppets in,
Mhm.
all forms of media.
Well,
Yes.
they really kind of had the last laugh in some ways because they went to England and did the Muppet Show in England, and it won all these Emmys, and it was kind of I used to watch the Muppet Show, it was very successful. I never really got the Muppet stuff. I felt like they were talking a language I couldn't understand because they kind of just sort of threw you into this world, and it didn't resonate, I guess, with me. I found that part to be kind of like the least interesting part of your recurring thing. And I think other people kind of felt the same way as well.
Well, it's just that it wasn't that the Muppets weren't funny. It was just that the Muppets
Fit,
didn't belong there. It's like
Right.
going to like a party where, that's just not who you are, that wasn't that they weren't edgy in their own way, the Muppets, for kids programming. It was that they weren't going to a party where people were dropping acid, I mean,
Right. Yeah. I've watched the first episode a couple of times now, and that's the only thing that I'm sitting here. I'm like, this is the only thing that doesn't work. And I know, the Muppets had a recurring thing in the first couple of seasons, um, and then it was quickly dropped. Yeah, the Muppets never worked for me, and I love the Muppets. I think the Muppet Show, especially when the Muppets kind of moved into the early '80s and SNL. Lorne Michael leaves in 1980, and from 1980 to 1985, it's what I always call the SNL lost years because there's not a lot of classic sketches. There's not a lot of things that come out of that era that people remember fondly, if they remember it all. But the Muppet Show at around the same time, some amazing guests, some amazing sketches, some amazing musical performances. Um, at the same time, you also had Midnight Special kind of going on at the same time, which again, some amazing performances and stuff. So it wasn't like, comedy was dead or sketch comedy was dead. You had other things going on. Just SNL had a fallow couple 5 6 years, but you had other places picking up the slack. And the Muppets, when they're on their own, doing their own thing, fantastic. I mean, I recommend everyone both the Muppet Show from the original run and then when they did the Muppet Show Tonight, which was like that late '90s redo, was also fantastic. I mean, I still randomly quote some things from there that I don't think anybody other than maybe Ross understands the reference. Like, and I won't reference it now because we're going to get into the weeds with it. But yeah, Muppets are great. Muppets on SNL, not so great.
Yeah, I think Muppets Tonight was maybe the first appointment viewing that I had, as a young, like it was the first thing where I was like, all right, Thursdays in front of the TV, got it. So
yeah. And then it got moved to Sundays at one point. Anyway,
I mean,
let's not get into the weeds with it.
Prince changing his name and then the bear security guard saying that he was a draft dodger is just the funniest thing in the world to me still. So.
Okay, so my favorite reference to that show, again, we do a show for us, is the episode where it's Pierce Brosnan as James Bond and he blows up the wall and the security guard is in the bathtub and he goes, "This is why I moved out of my mother's house." And that's just okay. So we'll put one in. We put that in there for us. We can take it out in post.
No, don't.
I want to touch on, we talked about kind of I just mentioned kind of the fallow years of 80, 85, and then Lorne comes back in 85. Why are those? I mean, I know they're not my favorite at all, but why did Lorne leave? And also, why are those years so, I mean, the way people talk about 80 to 85 and that cast, it's almost like a visceral hatred people have. Why do we think that is? I know it's different from what came before it, 75 to 80 with, that original cast, and they had Bill Murray, and then Steve Martin was pretty much a featured player. Martin Short.
Well, I think of them somewhat separately. I think of 80, 81, and then 81 to after that. The problem is you're trying to replicate something that was very successful, and trying to sort of start over, which is what would happen in 80, 81 when Gene Dominion became who worked on the show, but it was like a talent coordinator, was given sort of the reins to keep the show going. And, they hired new cast people, and some of them are very talented. I always felt sorry for some of them because they were so talented and they never really got, to sort of show just how talented they were and how funny they were. But it was kind of like a union of a lot of different things. The humor was really off. I mean, it just wasn't very funny. And they kept some things and changed some things, but it didn't like they had a real game plan about sort of how to sort of move ahead. They were kind of making it up as they go along. And they had a little trouble even getting guests after a while because it was so bad and the ratings really kind of went down. And at the end of that season, this sort of short season 6, they almost pulled the plug on the show. It would have been like kind of the time to sort of do it, and they kept it going. Now, one reason I think this show has always kept going is it makes money. In terms of advertising and commercials, because it actually appeals to the demographic all the advertisers, want, which is like people in their 20s and 30s, people that have income. So there's always going to be an economic reason behind everything with mostly with TV. But the question became who's going to run it, who's going to take over. Laura Michaels wasn't going to come back, so they got sort of someone who had been there in the beginning, which was Dick Ebersol. And, the seasons that followed, they're a little bit sort of hit miss. They had some talented cast members. They had some funny moments, and so on. I think the problem is it's sort of lumped into, 7, 8, 9, 10, or lumped in with 6. And It really was, to me, it was very, very different. Because, they also had, they had Eddie Murphy. That was sort of the sort of person that continued on. Joe Piscopo was the other. And that actually did make a difference because he did become in the middle of all this, even became a breakout star. I mean, he even hosted the show once when he was a cast member. mostly because of somebody was indisposed who was supposed to stayed out too late the night before and wasn't really in any shape to host the show. So, so there were, some of the sketches that you see, the Eddie Murphy sketches, et cetera, were Joe Piscopo were actually from that, era.
But also, that it is a testament to Lorne Michaels, or having a person that has that shares the sensibility of the show, because that's when Julia Louis-Dreyfus was on during that time. I think Larry David wrote during that time. You can't say, gee, they weren't very talented. Those people weren't very talented. No, it's a question of how the show came together. You could have the most talented people in the world. You look at, movies and TV shows that have, people who are huge, and, the movie bombs or the TV show bombs. And you think, how could that be? All these talented people, because, you need to have someone pulling it all together who matches the sensibility of what's going on.
Yeah, and the difference is what they lost. They lost a creative. Lorne Michaels is a creative producer, given the title, and Gene Dominion was not, and Dick Ebersol was not, and it makes a big difference having sort of like this creative person at the helm of the show.
I always say this to Dr. Tropiano here. The 80s everybody likes this 80s nostalgia. Let's face it, it was a crappy decade, for the most part.
Yeah, and like Larry David is a great example because he was in the writer's room and he got one sketch on the air, and it kind of bombed when they did it. But if you look at like the bones of it, it's basically Seinfeld and Curb. It's like, I think it's like a courtroom sketch or something, or it's a mediation something, but it has that same kind of pattern of all the best Seinfeld, all the best Curb, and it's like, it just, it's kind of like, you guys don't get it, but your kids are gonna love it, from Back to the Future or
and
something.
he kept quitting like every week.
Yeah.
Quit, and then he'd come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, classic Larry David.
Yeah. I think also, for when I always look at it, like I said, those seasons in the early 80s are not remembered fondly, even though you had Eddie Murphy and kind of at the end of that. For me, I think it's because of the two casts that are sandwiched in between. You have the original cast, which you always hear, it's never as good as it was the original cast, and I'm like, I don't agree. I think there were highs and lows even the first 5 seasons, but that cast that came after, in that late 80s cast, when you start having like Phil Hartman, Dana Carvey, Conan O'Brien as a writer, those mid seasons 6 to 10 are sandwiched between two kind of like, it's like like a howitzer was being shot into your home every weekend with those casts. And in 85 started that run all the way up to about 2005 of just a good 20-year string of just highlights and classic sketches and things like that. And I think in the show notes I talk about from 80, you have Lorne Michaels and that classic cast of 85 that kind of, and they start adding Mike Myers and everybody, Victoria Johnson, all these like wonderful comedic actors and writers. And then of course that goes into the early 90s with Adam Sandler, David Spade, that group, into the Will Ferrell, Anna Gasteyer, Molly Shannon in the late 90s. It was a conga line of just, again, classic cast and classic sketches. That section I have labeled on the show notes here of classic sketches and classic cast that like every weekend there was a sketch that like still lives on as people like, oh, remember that one? Remember that time? Remember that thing? And I think that's why also those mid-season, the 6 to 10, 6 to 9 get overlooked, because it's sandwiched between some heavy hitters.
And the seasons you're citing, the people you're citing, a lot of them stayed a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually made a difference. I mean, they sort of like Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman era. I mean, they sort of spilled into each other, but some of them were, a lot more people were on for like 5 years, for sort of 5 years, and sometimes even more. Or they didn't make changes to the cast.
Right.
If you sort of look at the cast list, they would add maybe 1 or 2 featured players. A lot of them were writers, But I think that makes a difference because, why do we like television shows? Usually because there's characters on it we see every week that we want to see every week, and then then the eras that you're talking about were times that we did want to see Dana Carvey and Phil Hartman, and you wanted to see those people, every week. I remember it being like, I don't want things to change. It should stay like this, but it's not going to.
Also, listen, we have to circle back and give Lorne Michaels a lot of credit, because if you look at the constant, what's the constant? What was the difference between those years that didn't work? And yes, people stayed longer, blah, blah, blah. But there was something this is his thing. He just has the ability to coordinate this show, to put together this show, to hire the right combination of people. Yeah, there's certain episodes that are not working, whatever, but boy, when it took a while to build it back up, but when it came together, it becomes golden, right? I mean, you have all these seasons, that managed to work. So,
and I know, again, I'm biased because, like Ross said earlier, those seasons, both which were airing live and then being rerun, were what I started watching when I was 11, 12, 13 years old. So those are that 10, 15-year chunk of SNL is my SNL. I know by the time I got to college, I didn't have a TV in my dorm. I wasn't watching it. So those years from like 2007 to like 2013, when like Bill Hader and Jason Sudeikis, which I had to go, I've gone back and watched those type of things. I wasn't watching those live. I don't have the relationship with those the way I did the previous seasons, or the same way I have it with, I started watching again like 2015, 2016 onward. The last 10 years, I have a different relationship with the show than I did, like,
Well,
those.
you were born in the right comedy era, the right comedy
Yeah.
decade, so to speak, because I always felt sorry for the people in the 80s, who
Yeah.
started watching, who did what you just described, but it was in the 80s. And it was, a lot of it was a bit of a groan, it was sort of like,
Right.
and some people say faithful to the show like we did, but a lot of people, I think, probably they lost a lot of viewers during that period of time.
it's interesting for me as probably the oldest in the group, that I mean, the original cast was my cast, but I have to say, and a lot of the other casts I liked a lot, but for me, the Tina Fey, Seth Meyers, Rachel Dratch, Maya Rudolph, I feel as connected to those years as I do pretty much the original years. And I think it's because there was a shift in sensibility. It became topical it became much more topical to me in a different kind of way. Certainly more political, but we can get into that. There's reasons it became more
Right.
political because of just TV in general, and politicians became celebrities. So, but that's what's also great about the show, is that you go back and forth. It's like people don't watch it for a while, don't watch it with the frequency, and then suddenly they're watching it again because of what's going on in their lives or what's going on in the world. So that's another thing about the show that remains a constant.
For me too, I know, you had Norm Macdonald and Spade and Dennis Miller doing Weekend Update prior to that. But for me, I think when Weekend Update became Weekend Update, truly was when you had Tina Fey and Jimmy Fallon and Amy Poehler doing it. Because that's when it became, because now people even say, oh, with like Michael Che and Colin Yost doing it, that's the best part of every episode. Like you see people see that like all over social media and ever. And I think sometimes, yes, Weekend Update is, especially if it's an episode where it's kind of like, oh, well, it's not as funny, especially when it's a guest, you're like, oh, they're going to be great. And you're like, oh, wow. But for me, I think when Weekend Update became Weekend Update was that right around the turn of the century, 99, 2001, that era, when it became that if you don't watch any other part of the show, wait until 12:15, go watch Weekend Update, then go back to bed or whatever. Like that's the part of the show you have to watch. And I still think that's true and relevant now.
Well, there's a reason for that. And in watching so many Weekend Updates and really like going over the history of politics on television, once cable news really became popular, with Fox and MSNBC and CNN, and politics was on 24/7. And then Jon Stewart made The Daily Show really, really popular. That was all, Jon Stewart came on, I think, in 1999. That politicians became celebrities. You were seeing them all the time. So while they would do politics, decades before, they didn't, the political characters, people playing political characters, did not happen all that much. I mean, they would do Ted Koppel and whatever, but not those politicians who they parody, aside from the presidents. Like, they would never do somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene
Right.
in the 80s, whatever the
Janet
equivalent,
Janet
with the
Reno.
frequency. Because then what happened is that they just became household names. Like, aside from the president, all those people that are just part of politics became household names. So that's what I think changed Weekend Update. And, changed it. It changes depending on who's doing it, like Colin Quinn, Dennis Miller, Norm Macdonald. They were all great, but the times really changed. So it opened up this whole world that didn't exist anymore in terms of recognizability. And, politics was really, all these weird people from politics were in your house on television all the time. So SNL and all these other shows benefited from it. Colbert Report, all this stuff happened. So politics became funny and tragic at the same time, as opposed to the Nixon days when it was, different.
Yeah, this is kind of the part of the show that I've been looking forward to the most, is just sort of like the question to you two, the experts, of like, is SNL a quote political show? Because, Weekend Update has existed, since the very early days. They had the debate 75 between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, which, was a very, it's a very incisive. We had talked about doing a President's Day episode of looking at all the different presidents, and we might do that, next year. But just like, it's a good, incisive sketch. I do think Weekend Update is so much, like we sort of talked about, influenced by the Daily Show, because the early Daily Show, like the Craig Kilborn years and then early Jon Stewart, was more like The Onion, where it was just like making fun of, area man eats a watermelon or what, like that kind of goofy stuff, more so than like what it became in the Bush era. And then I know like Michael Che was who they wanted to replace Jon Stewart. And he ended up, taking the SNL job instead, or keeping the SNL job. But, so it's like, is SNL inherently a political show? Is it a show that has just like taken on politics as part of its evolution?
Well, politics became part of pop culture in a very different way than it was in the 70s and 80s and even the early 90s. So you can't parody something that people don't know, because I don't think, because there's no common ground, right?
Mhm.
You're making fun of something that the mass public doesn't understand. But once politicians became lower level, lower tier, and I mean non-president, became celebrities, then all bets were off. And so I think that it's not so much that SNL became more political, it's that the world became more political because of 24/7 news. And so SNL is just responding to what's out there, and the interconnectivity of everything. So the topicality, and TV was just used in such a evolved, and was used politically in such a different mass way. I mean, it was always used in politics, but the familiarity everybody had with it, sometimes to a fault, it just became much more popularized. So
And I agree with that, because I think of even kind of somewhat people in my mind who were kind of marginalized political figures like George Santos, that everyone knew who he is,
Mhm.
and it
yeah,
wasn't just he was on once, he's recurring, it seems. But the idea that you would do someone like that who became sort of famous for being who he is, or who he was, sort of says something about the idea where, back in the 70s was sort of following kind of the tradition of the 60s of people like David Fry used to imitate, Nixon and so on. Even Nixon appeared on Laugh-In for 2 seconds to say Sakatumi. It only would really be the president that you would make fun of. And it would never be like the first lady. Usually not like a whole lot of satirical things to say about Betty Ford. But the idea that, now these people are all in the center, they're what we see on TV like all the time, that people know who these people are. Because you're not going to do a satire, of someone that people don't know who this person is. And I'm sure there's some people who don't. And they're fortunate actually not to know who they are. But I think that has made a big difference, that there is a sort of celebrity sort of element to famous people.
I mean, it's interesting. You go back, one of the, it's funny because when SNL came on the air, Nixon wasn't president, but they parodied Nixon because Nixon was such a pop culture figure, right? And one of the edgy, I mean, you talk about, I mean, I don't mean to jump ahead, but you talk about one of the edgiest political sketches was Nixon's Final Day sketch in the first season. And they had Pat Nixon, when it's based on Woodward and Bernstein's book, The Final Days, about Nixon talking to the oil paintings in the White House. And I was saying this to, Steve and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. And so Madeline Kahn's playing Pat Nixon, with Nixon reminiscing, and Dan Aykroyd is playing Nixon, not, with a mustache, is not even in Nixon makeup, but he does this whole thing. And I just, so I can probably say this because I'm Jewish, but, he has this whole thing with Henry Kissinger, and he wants Henry Kissinger to pray with him. And he says, "What's the matter, Jew boy? You don't pray, Jew boy, Jew." And he kept saying it. And when I watched it for the book, I was so taken aback by it, because you just you wouldn't hear, they wouldn't do that on TV now. They would bleep it or something. But you think like this was on TV in the 70s, maybe the 70s was more liberal in some ways. So but they could do it because Nixon was such a, he was a celebrity, it was beyond, partly because of, running against John F. Kennedy, and partly because of, he was president of Watergate and all of that stuff. So, but they really went there.
Well, and I think that with that example was he wasn't president anymore at the time.
Yeah.
So that gives you a little bit more room to do things. In some ways, I think there's maybe a little bit too much politics on the show, because some of it's not very satirical. It's just the fact that the person is sort of being imitated, which isn't really enough, or have more of like a satirical point, sort of edge to it. I'd like to talk about hosts a little bit, because they're the ones that never get any attention. If that's okay, not to be taking over your.
Yeah.
I always think about who makes like the good hosts, and I always liked a little bit when they had some people that were not the typical performer. And it definitely can be hit and misses, like with sports people. But there's some of them that were just like great. And I always like that sort of when you feel surprised that they're actually very funny in sketches. I'm thinking of like a few seasons back. I don't remember what the first two initials are, but Watt.
JJ Watt. It's JJ Watt. Yeah, it's so funny because I was
really
thinking
funny.
of him.
And the Manning brothers were very funny, and they used them in very funny ways. And then there's people that you think are going to be really good, and they're kind of not. I also think it kind of showcases people who are kind of serious actors to actually be, that get to be funny, and you realize they are funny, but we never really see that in the roles that they actually, sort of play. I think everybody kind of questions their choices. You find out who's going to host, and you think of, oh yeah, and some people they have is kind of like the standby good person who's always good. I was talking about this to somebody else that whenever they had like somebody who turned out to be an awful host, like an awful person, not to name names, but people who just like, you can look it up, the 10 worst hosts. They were always, people always say, well, why do they keep having John Goodman back or now Wellman and so on? Because it was probably a sigh of relief after going through hell for a week to actually have John Goodman and know it's not going to be contentious and not going to be,
Name names.
he's
Name
good.
names.
He's a good guy. So it's sort of like a break, I imagine, for them to work with them, because there's a lot that we don't know that goes on behind the scenes, particularly that this person has to sit down with writers and come up with sketches.
There are those hosts, whether they're funny or not, returning hosts or not, there are those that understand the assignment, and then there's others that they don't know what they're doing there. I think two serious actors that don't do a lot of comedy. At least one of them's doing comedy more now in his post Mad Men career. But John Hamm, when he was doing Don Draper is not a comedic character at all. He's the epitome of a Greek tragic figure. But you see him at the height of the Mad Men. He goes on SNL. You're like, holy crap, this guy has some comedic chops. And then I'm also thinking of like Timothy Chalamet, who does very serious, very important type of films and very dramatic films. Dune, the Bob Dylan biopic that just came out. He's a very talented, very serious young actor. But you can put him on SNL, and he's, they just let him cook, as the kids say. They just let him chew the scenery, and they understand the assignment. Where there's some other actors. I'm not going to name names, but she was in a Star Wars film and she's been in a few other movies that I like her in those movies, but she hosted and you're like, what are you doing? So I think sometimes it's about understanding the assignment. And then you got those recurring hosts, I think like Emma Stone, she always knocks it out of the park. Justin Timberlake always knocks it out of the park, even when he's doing skits that I don't necessarily think are funny, like the Bee Gees one. I never found the Bee Gees things that him and Jimmy Fallon do funny, and I love the Bee Gees. It doesn't work for me. That's fine. It's not meant for me, maybe. But just there's certain hosts you say, oh, they're going to be a good time, and then you got those hosts where you're just surprised. I think even this season there's some hosts that I'm like, oh, that's a neat choice. And then they come on, you're like, wow, okay, I'm impressed. And there's others where I'm, not so much.
It's like SNL 50, in SNL 50 with Meryl Streep, who'd never been on SNL before,
right.
Came and did the Alien sketch where she plays Kate McKinnon's mother and kills it, right? And It's hilarious. And people are like, oh my God, it's not like Meryl Streep's never done comedy, but she's known as a dramatic actress. So it's always a really nice surprise.
I mean, she killed it as Mrs. Rafferty Sr. Just was sold it for me. For anyone who hasn't seen it, they bring back the Rafferty Alien sketch, which my favorite version of that is the Christmas one where she goes to Santa's workshop personally, but that's me. But with Pedro Pascal and he's talking, and then Meryl Streep turns around and is like, so what's your name, mustache? That right there sold it for me, where she turns in her seat and stuff. I'm just like, I'm in. There are certain, and I think SNL, and we'll get in a little bit about our favorite sketches and stuff like that, but there are those moments where they hit that point. You're like, okay, I'm in. I'm buying what you're selling. I think we haven't really talked a lot on this show, but there's a comedy sitcom from Canada called Letterkenny, which Letterkenny hit that point for me where the first episode or two I didn't quite get, and then they do a joke in like the third episode. I'm like, all right, I'm in. I'm buying whatever you're selling, and I think SNL, of course, they have a lot shorter time. They don't have a 20-minute sitcom format to do it. They have a 5 to 8 minute sketch. They got to pull you in. But I think some of the best sketches, they hit that point. You're like, okay, I'm in. I get it. That line sold it for me, and now I'm in it to the end. I'm on this roller coaster, and we're going. Which I think good comedy. I mean, Family Guy, American Dad, they have those type of moments too. Simpsons, good comedy have those moments where you don't quite get it yet, and then they lock you in with the premise or the joke or the thesis of that episode or that sketch. You're like, I'm here for it. I get it. It might be obscure, but I get it, and I think that helps sometimes, and that goes back to the host understand the assignment. I think it's that moment where, like, if you hit that mark perfectly and you get it and the audience gets it and everyone's on board, thinking of people that from hosting that really sold me. Billie Eilish recently, when she's hosted now, and then she also, when she does the musical, she'll come in and do a sketch. I knew her as a singer. I like her as a singer, as a pop act. I didn't know she could have those comedic chops, and then she hosted that Christmas episode a couple years ago and just sold it. And I'm like, holy crap! She she's a triple threat. That kid, she can sing, she can dance, and she can do some comedy. And then she came back and did the Whiskers Are We callback with Kate McKinnon, which was just that right there. I'm like, and that was like the last sketch of the night. I'm like, that's the perfect way to end it, and yeah, there's hosts that get it and there's hosts that don't.
I think it's expectation too, because we know Billie Eilish just being this ethereal, serious, singer, because and so I think when you can break the persona, it's really great also,
Right.
And she's young too. I think that helps when you're young.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm always surprised when certain guests are, I'm like, oh, I didn't expect this to be the best episode of the season, but hey, here we are and I'm on board.
And I definitely think that happened the first time that John Mulaney hosted. I mean, they've had him back, I think, like 800 times since. Nate Bargatze, I was hoping that he would do well. They've had him back once already. And he's been a great host. And it's just so interesting to me, like, not so much what makes a great host, but like that the role of host, the Five Timers Club, it started as this kind of like in joke, sort of like, oh, the true fans, like they know about and now it's like, it's become so overdone to the point that it kind of, like it does kind of drain me a little bit now, like the pomp and, everything like that. But just, I wonder if you want to talk about just the role of host, as sort of this title.
Well, I think, you're walking into a show that's like a factory, and the factory's already in business. And you have to kind of find your place in it. And, if you were to do like even like an analysis of it to see how frequently the host appears in sketches, you can kind of tell, and granted, there's always sketches that get cut. I don't know how frequently host sketches get cut, but there's sometimes the host kind of disappears a little bit, in the mix, and you're kind of wondering, where did they go? And so, I think it must be, to put it on the other side, it must be challenging for them to have this new person come in, and there's only a very short period of time to get it all, to work. The good thing about hosts is they're not going to be there next week. So if they're not good, it's okay. It's not like when someone gets cast on a show and you don't like that person and they're on the show for, they're on a series. They're there forever. They don't go away until the show is over or they leave. But at least you kind of know. I mean, I think having the rotating hosts also is what keeps people watching, because I think people do tune in when, do I want to see Shane Gillis again on March 1st? No, I don't, to be perfectly honest. I don't know what there's some story, might not to be a conspiracy theorist, but there's something going on in the back there. This guy didn't get hired, and then he gets to host a show, which to me is like graduating, not, it's like skipping grades, and then he's coming back again. And I don't remember if he was on this season or the season before, when he was first on, but I just find it bizarre that he would be the person, especially after they just had this 50th, have Lady Gaga come back and then have him a little bit later,
I think I think also there's a thing, I was just reading with the right before the SNL 50 an interview with Jesse Eisenberg. I think they were talking to him about real pain, but when he was host, he really wanted to be a writer, and he came in with a whole bunch of sketches, and somebody told him, "Yeah, it's okay, they'll love it," and then he realized, no, not so much. People didn't like that he had written all these sketches, and he was just so young that he kind of didn't realize, no, that's a no-no. You have to work with the writers. Whereas like Pedro Pascal is probably one of the really good hosts lately. Came up, I didn't know this. Steve Tropiano was saying this to me. Came up with the whole idea of being Marcello Hernandez's mother, which was based on his mother. And so that's the kind of and was in drag, and that's the kind of person that you want, who comes in with ideas or who's game to do anything, and can pull it off. So
and wanted to be in a sketch with Marcello Hernandez. So
yeah.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
somebody can write that for them.
Well, I think Pedro Pascal is a great example of someone who's done very serious work. I mean, he was in Game of Thrones. Now he's in The Last of Us and Mandalorian, and these are none of these characters he's doing the last 5-7 years that he's become, like, his star has finally risen a little bit, even though he's been around for a very long time. But the kind of the three big tentpole franchises he's been a part of that people know him from, very serious roles. They're not even comedic roles within those universes, where there are some more comedic roles maybe in those universes, in those series, not him. And yet he comes on SNL and he just again knocks out of the park, understood the assignment, and like with the 50th, they finally round the base with Domingo, with Sabrina Carpenter and him coming in as Ronaldo, the brother, and everything. I just like, and just, I mean, yeah, Pedro Pascal is great. He's fantastic. I like him in other things. I love it when he's on SNL. I thought the gritty Mario Kart reboot thing they did was just, as a 90s kid who grew up on Mario Kart, who's still playing Mario Kart. In fact, we just had a few months back, we had some storms here in Georgia, and both my brothers were in that area, so they came stay with us here, and for about a week where they had no power. And I got to introduce my 10-year-old and my 4-year-old niece to Mario Kart, for the first time, and got to play Mario Kart with them. And Mario Kart's such a staple. And then here's SNL doing kind of that gritty Mario Kart thing. And I'm like, all right, that's for a very specific audience, but for that audience, it is great,
Yeah.
So, and then I think, because Ryan, you talked about like how you sort of fell off from watching it for a period, but I wonder, because I remember watching, I mean, this is how much of it makes no surprise to me that I have become like a media studies person later in life, because I remember Saturday nights toggling between NBC and Fox, because when SNL would go to break, I wanted to see what was on Mad TV, and I would switch back and forth, and I was always like kind of, keeping little notes in my head of, oh, this one was better this week. But so it's like I fell off at the same time as you, but it wasn't that I stopped watching it. It's that I stopped watching it live, because I was like, well, I can always see the cold open, the musical, numbers if I want to, Weekend Update, and then the 10-to-1 sketch. I can watch it in the morning and, go out and have my Saturday night or watch something else or whatever. So it's not that I ever stopped watching it. It's that I consumed it differently because the technology was different. We talked a little bit about, but it's like, it's the perfect format for YouTube, and for TikTok and this kind of new way of consuming things. I know the James Corden show, the Late Late Show or whatever, like he would get, like something like 40,000 viewers in, terrestrial TV, but his carpool karaoke would do huge YouTube numbers.
Right.
And so it's like, I think that the technology landscape sort of dictated a lot of the show's consumption. And it's like maybe more people are watching it than ever, but they're watching it differently. I know it's up on Peacock and YouTube the next day, and that's how I watch it a lot of times now.
Sometimes it's up like that night where like
Mhm.
they start putting the clips like on
Yeah.
you'll see on Twitter and Blue Sky they're putting clips, and then like about they cut the commercial, and then like it's the next sketch is coming on, and the previous sketch is already up on YouTube, and sometimes you can tell it's like if there was a mechanical or technical error, it's the dress, but but that sketch is up there because sometimes I notice the sketch will go up that night, and then it comes off, and then like later on Sunday afternoon it goes back up. I'm like, oh, they threw the dress rehearsal version up, and then
Yeah.
now this live version or whatever, and yeah, sometimes it's like in real time they're getting posted on YouTube, and Peacock and stuff like at like while it's still on. Like it hasn't even premiered on the West Coast yet.
Mhm.
The East Coast is still, it's midnight on the East Coast, and they're putting the cold open and the first sketch or the monologue up.
And I know like some of the cut for time stuff would appear on like I remember buying best of like Will Ferrell DVDs, in the early DVD era, and that's how you got to see some of these cut sketches. Now they're just up on YouTube the same as, the regular sketches. Like
Yeah.
there was the ska, or it was the Swing Revival band sketch. That was a recent cut for time one that I really liked. But yeah, it's so interesting that I think you know, this format change has rewarded it in some ways, but of course, they need to sell ads for over-the-air
My
TV.
my favorite cut sketch is Will Ferrell plays a high school drama teacher. And it actually
Yes.
Oh,
they're waiting for the cast list to go up for Bye Bye Birdie, I think. It's very funny. I like I said, I like it because I think almost everybody is actually in the sketch, and he's very funny.
Mhm.
Very funny in it.
That
but
one and Gus Chiggins are two of my all-time
Yeah, I like
favorites, and they're
yes,
both
yeah.
cut for
Well,
time. Yeah.
one of mine is one that was cut from the dress. It's Fred Armisen, Bill Hader, as the two doormen at Christmas
Yeah,
time, and they're starting,
hysterical.
and you can tell like the audience is not getting it, and they just
Right.
start screwing around when like
Yeah.
Bobby Moynihan comes out. They're like, but Bobby Moynihan,
Yeah.
and Bobby's like, oh, are we not on script anymore? And
Yeah.
they just completely run with it. And then what's his face? I'm blanking on his name. I can see his face. Uh, he was in Ray, the host.
Jamie Foxx.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I want to say Jamie Lee Curtis for some reason. I'm like, no, that's definitely not Jamie Lee Curtis. Yeah, Jamie Foxx come out, and you see, and Bill Hader talks about this later on in interviews where they realize, oh wait, we're on TV and this is real. Like we can't be like just dicking around, which is basically what him and Fred Armisen were doing at that point.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think a lot of this harkens back to, the Lazy Sunday, when that went viral, when they started doing all of that, I mean, I'm sure that I don't remember the exact time period in terms of years, but when that went so insane, the Andy Samberg rap basically with Chris Parnell, I think that just opened up so much in terms of technology and what was being posted. I mean, when we were watching SNL 50, I mean, right afterwards, almost every sketch was online. Almost every single sketch was
Yeah.
posted. And that really has benefited the show in a lot of ways. But you're right, in terms of regular TV, whatever regular TV is anymore, it's changed viewing habits a lot. But my God, the amount of people that you get watching sketches over and over and over again is amazing. I mean, that's, I think one of the most watched sketches ever, and it was a cold open, was, and one of my favorites is Tina Fey and Amy Poehler as Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton. Was I forget what the numbers are, but that just was watched so many millions of times by people that, compared to what it would ever have been watched on the show, and it was actually quite timely. So, it's this extra life.
So I think briefly we do need to talk about the musical guests and some kind of classical music performances before we wrap it up here, because we can't talk about the show without musical performances. That's baked into the DNA. And there have been some amazing musical performances over the years, some controversial, which now in retrospect, one the most controversial isn't as controversial anymore. And there was a kind of a mea culpa with it on the 50th, which I think was really neat. But yeah, let's talk about the musical guests and kind of, because at the beginning we talked about how like Lorne Michaels was trying to make a little bit of a variety show, and classically from the 50s onward, Ed Sullivan and these other types of shows always featured, comedy sketches or a comedian or something like that, as well as musical guests. I mean, famously the Tonight Show.
Even as far back as vaudeville too.
Yeah. So let's kind of talk about kind of the history of the musical guest, and kind of, I don't even have a question for this. It's just kind of I think like music, like jazz, just riff about.
And to have artists, I mean, I think what the difference was, this is pre-MTV. In the mid 1970s, you didn't see a lot of musical performers as much on TV. I mean, there were variety shows, but usually the people that were on variety shows were pretty mainstream. You did have like Midnight Special, where you actually would get to see, but there are a lot of performers that you never saw perform on television at all. And in the beginning, and they're trying to sort of, I think, keep the edge, is having performers on. I always use Kate Bush as an example. I never knew who that was. The first time I ever saw her, she was on SNL. And there were a lot of people like that. Or there were people that were well known by their fans and so on, but maybe were not known as much in the mainstream. And then they started to mix it up a little bit. I mean, granted, Billy Preston it was in the first episode. That song was like a number one. It was a big hit, and even Janis Ian's song was, even though they're two very different performers. And then they had Paul Simon, but then they did a mixture of people, some people, and they did have people like jazz musicians. They did have people who were not necessarily like Leon Redbone, for example. People that were not, you would not see them anywhere else, unless the only time you would see them would be on a show like SNL. So I think what SNL did is, and it became a very big thing for an artist to actually appear on SNL. It still is. I mean, there's a lot of people, and I think part of this is just generational for both of us, that we are like, who is this person? They say the name of somebody, it's usually one name, and we have to like look up and see who it is, because I have absolutely no idea. But my students know who they are. And so, it's a big deal for somebody's career to actually appear on SNL.
Yeah, I think I think that there's certain, like, I remember when it feels like it was 100 years ago, but it wasn't. When Lady Gaga was first on SNL, like she was great. It's perfect for her because it's like her at the piano, and that was a really big breakout moment for her. And then I think Madonna came on at some point when she hosted the show, and they were in something together. So there are some like great moments like that, that just are. I mean, the first time Billie Eilish was on the show was a really big deal for people, but I personally like I like the idea of discovering somebody on the show, even though younger people or whoever knows that person, but it's that moment where that person, it's almost like a crossover moment, getting to be on network television, for a musical act that, musical acts now tend to be so niche, that the way the music industry is, there wasn't, when we were younger, there was top 40, and and it's just not like that anymore. So there's not that many platforms where you can just watch somebody and everybody kind of appreciates the person at the same time. And you saw in not to keep referencing SNL 50, but you kind of saw it on that. It wasn't accidental that they pair Paul Simon with Sabrina Carpenter, right? So
right, which I thought was great. I mean, I love Sabrina Carpenter. Of all the recent pop acts, when she came out, I'm like, oh, I get it. I kind of get her. But again, I mean, her performance, I wasn't really into her. Then I heard her on SNL. I was like, oh, okay. And then the whole like, I'm on SNL and you're not. I'm like, okay. And she's funny. She's adorable. She has sex appeal. She has really great music, and she's funny. Yeah, sign me up. Same thing with Chappell Roan. I didn't really get Chappell Roan. I saw her live, and I'm like, oh, I get it now. Which I think is great. I think for millennials like me that I kind of know what's going on in pop music, and then I really don't know what's going on in pop music at the same time. SNL kind of keeps me at least current, But yeah, some of the musical performances, I always think of course, Sinead O'Connor when she ripped the picture of the Pope, which again was so controversial at the time, and she got so much crap in the media about it, and now people looking back like, oh, she was kind of right, and they had that mea culpa and the 50th special. But for me, my favorite SNL, of course, we mentioned Billie Eilish earlier. I thought when she did Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, great. I need a whole breathy, jazzy Billie Eilish Christmas album yesterday, but that's a whole other thing. And then, but for me, the best performance, and of course, we've had, Eminem a couple years ago did a medley of his stuff, which was great, which are one of my top 5 performances. But Elvis Costello, when he started, I can't name the song that he started, but it was like the network was like, you need to do this song, and he was like, no, started doing it, and then he just stops midstream and does radio. For me, which growing up, I saw that and I'm like, oh, that's scripted. And you find out, no, that was one of the rare spontaneous things. And I love Elvis Costello for that, because radio is such a better song anyway.
Yeah. Well, Prince was another thing too.
Yeah.
With Prince closing the show. Was Miley Cyrus, that's still crazy after all these years? Am I mixing that up? Was that at SNL?
That was at the the anniversary show before this one.
When she did this down version of that was unbelievable to me.
It was their 40. It must have been like their 40th.
Mm-hmm. That was
not that old. So
she's also a great example of somebody, who's obviously reinvented herself, but you got to see all these colors of her on SNL that you would not seen before, and that was an amazing performance. And I think it's the unexpected nature of it sometimes is what makes it really great. That's something live TV just
she makes fun of herself too. She makes fun of Hannah being on a Disney show. She kind of apologized for the whole wrecking ball that she did on MTV. So she, people like that. People like when people apologize for things, I think.
Well, when they come on, Steve and I always love the Jennifer Aniston thing when Vanessa Bayer is imitating Rachel from Friends, and Jennifer Aniston. That's a whole other thing you could do a whole show about, is when the celebrity comes on with the person that's impersonating them, and Nick Cage, Mark Wahlberg, all these people doing that. People love when people are making fun of themselves. So
yeah. Well, and like Jennifer Aniston, classic example, when she did when her and Brad Pitt were together, and she did the Fight Club thing,
right?
SNL, kind of making fun of the movie and herself. I mean, again, those that understand the assignment, those that are able, especially like I said, those serious actors that can kind of come on and poke fun at themselves, poke fun at their careers, poke fun of a gaffe they might have done. I think that's what makes it great, because it makes you feel like, oh, we're all kind of in on the joke together.
Yeah.
It makes it accessible. It doesn't make it, and sometimes SNL has done something where I'm like, that is for a very specific TikTok audience. I don't get it. When they bring on certain people or make certain references, you're like, oh, that's for a Gen Z thing. I don't get it, but it's not for me. But then it's the Gen Z writers and actors that are doing it. So I'm like, well, it's them speaking to their cohort, whereas Colin Yost and Michael Shea being millennials, they are speaking my language, on Weekend Update. It's definitely that neo-lib millennial, the whole system is stupid type of vibe,
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I remember even like some of the Chris Farley stuff, like he was really funny, but there was a whole kind of like, I don't want to say bro culture because it's different than bro culture now, but like
Yeah.
where I think this is so not for me, but I get why they're doing this, you know? So that's
Yeah.
what it should be. That's what the show should be.
Yeah. I mean, they even poked fun at that when like Will Ferrell did the on Weekend Update, the fraternity guy that came on and like talk about Bill Clinton. He's definitely making fun of, and I saw that right before I was in college, and I was in college and I joined a fraternity, and I was like, oh, I get it now. The kind of like there is that like bro meathead type of stereotype of and I thought they did it great. Now, some of that sketch has not aged as well, but neither has the Clinton administration. So it's kind of part and parcel for that.
Interesting. Clinton was the only president, and right, Steve, not be on the show.
Yeah, he was never on the show.
Not the only one.
He
And
avoided it, I think, because
Monica
he was
Lewinsky.
married probably maybe once too many times, and you know.
So I've got a question for you, and this is, kind of something that has been percolating a little bit for me. But we talk about SNL as an institution. We're celebrating 50 years, and it's like there have been, I don't want to say challengers or competitors, but there have been alternatives like Mad TV, existed, went off, came back, went off, came back. If we think of SNL as an incubator or like a talent pool system, then all that was kind of like Ender's Game. But so like, do you
In Living
think,
Color.
yeah, in Living Color, another great example. So is it that is like SNL too big to fail? Like is it just so entrenched? Do you see like there being like any sort of alternative to it? Because I don't know that it's like I think like we talked about the TV ecosystem is just so hostile, to something like this if it doesn't have 50 years of roots dug in. I can't
Well,
imagine another
I mean, that's
challenger.
an excellent question. First, I wanted to bring up another, not really kind of competitor. Is do you remember? You ever hear the show Fridays by any chance?
Yes, yeah, with
Yes.
Michael Richards and Larry
Which is
David.
an
Yeah.
ABC version, except it was
Hmm.
on Friday. I think what is, to be honest with you, I think what is to SNL's advantage is it doesn't compete. It's not a show that's on a primetime schedule that they
Hmm.
have to move around and shift around, and that's what usually sort of happens. And I think because it is so, sort of entrenched in sort of the NBC sphere, that is something that helps a lot, and that's really kind of the reason why the show has continued. Also, because I think it has in mild ways, maybe kind of reinvented itself and trying to stay relevant, which is not really the case of TV series. Where, if you watch Grey's Anatomy 20 years ago when it started, it's the same, it's not that much different. The people have changed, the characters changed. And the thing is, there's much more room here, I think, for there to be change. And I think that in some ways it benefits from the change, but it also benefits from the fact that it kind of keeps its like structure.
I think it's this, I think there's certain shows that have been on, there's not very many, but have been on that long. If you think about The Tonight Show, right? Tonight Show started before my time, my parents' time, with Steve Allen and Jack Parr and then Johnny Carson. And yeah, now Jimmy Fallon, and it's not really The Tonight Show, but it is The Tonight Show. I mean, 60 Minutes and Meet the Press, those are news shows, they're not entertainment shows. But The Tonight Show is probably the best example where,
Johnny Carson didn't play games with people
right,
Hmm.
for an
he did,
hour.
yeah, but he did do silly sketches and characters and things.
Yeah.
But yeah, he didn't.
Occasionally. Yeah. He also had authors on. He
The
had a much
author,
different,
he
sort
was
of
much more, there was the
Right.
intellectual book segment and all of that. So I think, too big to fail is kind of a funny way to put it, but I don't think it's inaccurate. I mean, I don't know what the budget is of the show, but I think in comparison to a lot of other shows, it probably, the investment that they make financially is worth keeping it on, like what Steve was saying before in terms of economics.
And I don't know if people know this, but SNL exists in a lot of other countries. There
Yeah.
are about like 15 versions of it. You can go on YouTube. I think the Korean version is on, and it's exactly like SNL. It's the same format. It's all the same. It's just that it's in another culture, another country, and other performers. It's fascinating to me that you could actually take something like this and then sort of move it. And I think it's kind of almost like a testament when you can be, just the way Survivor and The Voice and all those reality shows can go from country to country to country. It's interesting that the format for this show can actually do that too. I mean, none of them have been on for 50 years or even close
Right.
to it.
But what is it everybody's fighting for now is intellectual property, right? Or IP. So if you think about it, the NBC IP of SNL, why would they not do it? Now, what's going to be interesting is, all right, so when Lorne Michaels finally retires, what will happen? Can it, because he's the one constant pretty much, right? So can it continue, can it reinvent itself without him? And then the rumor about, the closest thing would be if Tina Fey or Seth Meyers or somebody like that took it over, you would feel, okay, they get it. That consistency could probably continue under them. But if, not to put down Dick Ebersol at all, but if they brought in somebody like that, that would be a whole different situation. So we'll see, right?
I don't think he's ever going to retire. I think we got a Queen Elizabeth II situation where he's just going to like he's chaining himself to the to the chair, but that's me, which I mean I know he's 80, right? He's 80,
Something
79.
like that. Yeah.
I mean, I know he's getting up there in years. I personally don't want to see him go until he's ready, and if he's not ready and he's still having fun, then and I don't think anyone's, from what I've heard, no one's jockeying like push him out. There's always like, oh, maybe Keenan will take over, maybe Tina Fey will take over, maybe Michael Che will take over, and I think there are some great options there. I think there are some people that are kind of waiting in the wings that have been under his tutelage and do have his sensibilities that I think would be a great job. But I don't see him going anywhere.
My prediction is someone else is going to take over, and he's going to linger as a consultant. As an exec, he'll maybe retain his executive producer title, but he won't have as much responsibility. I don't think. Now he's sort of a celebrity. Granted, that book just came out about him and all these articles with the 50th. I mean, it's interesting because he kind of acts, is so humbled, that he doesn't say anything at the end of the 50th. He doesn't want to, sort of be in the spotlight, but he does appear on stage as he should.
He's such an interesting case of somebody who's there, but he's not there. And Steve and I were talking about that. He really didn't speak in the SNL 50 like you thought, okay, there's going to be that moment, and there wasn't. And I got to hand it to him for that. It's not like, you were joking before about like, is he going to chain himself to the desk? It reminded me of the Barbara Bush, Nancy Reagan skit where, Barbara Bush is taking over as first lady and Nancy Reagan is they're pulling her away and she's like holding on to the table and, doing all this stuff. And I think it's more like what Steve is saying, with Lorne Michaels, but he is a celebrity, but he's not, humble is not the right word, but he kind of understands what this is all about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's center stage without being center stage, which is a good role for a producer, I think.
Magnanimous, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And I always like when they still do it to this day, but you saw it a lot in the 90s when they incorporate into like the monologue or when they do like a walk and talk in the monologue and he's there, he's just like the grumpy dad. Like, he, even when he was a younger man, he was always like the grumpy dad, which I think is kind of his perfect role because you hear about him in real life and behind the scenes and he's not a grumpy person at all. Like people love him. People, really enjoy his company and being around him. And he's made a lot of friends in the industry over the years, but he definitely has cemented himself in kind of the SNL lore for lack of a better word, as like the grumpy behind the scenes dad that's telling everybody no, and I think he embraces that a little bit. I don't know if that was a role he made for himself or something that just kind of happened organically, but I do always love when they have Lorne in the hallway and he's just like, like grumpy and doesn't want it and like doesn't want the camera on him and stuff. And I love it. I get a kick out of that every time.
I miss the llama actually myself.
So before we wrap up, I think we've mentioned a few sketches. I know I have my list of just like favorite all-time sketches, but I figured before we do the book recommendation and the movie recommendation that we end the show with, we all kind of just talk about our favorite sketches and just give us a chance to gush a little bit, because I know this is a favorite show of all four of us, and I think it's our podcast and we want to gush a little bit for SNL. We can definitely do it. I think now's the right time.
I was waiting for this.
Oh, okay.
Steve,
So I mean, me too, to be honest, because I have some deep cuts that I'm excited to show off.
And I've actually narrowed it down to 3 or 4 things. It's so hard. I won't go on and on. I mean, the first Debbie Downer sketch where they're breaking up, I will just watch sometimes for no reason. And it's just the combination of the character in that. And then there's this sort of, I think it's a somewhat esoteric sketch, but it's Liza Minnelli tries to turn on a lamp. And it's Kristen Wiig doing Liza Minnelli.
Turn off a lamp.
Turn off a lamp, sorry. And not turn
Very
off.
different. Very different.
And I'm sure it has to do with being a gay man of a certain age, but the Kristen Wiig, they're going out to see cats and she's just Liza in like full Halston-y Liza. All she's trying to do is turn on the lamp and reminiscing about stuff. It's insane. It's different than Debbie Downer. Like they're just two different types of things. And then anything Stefan, is to me just he's the beloved. And I missed him on the SNL 50. It's sort of like this. He's sort of like the love child of John Mulaney and Bill Hader. John Mulaney writing it and Bill Hader playing him. So.
And now, Liza Minnelli tries to turn off a lamp.
Just let me truck him out over here. Oh, I see him. He's the scoundrel. He's the troublemaker right here. Time to turn this doodad off. Oh!
So, of course, he took two of mine.
He was going to say that, yeah.
Especially the Liza thing we watched to cheer us up and stuff. The most recent sketch I've liked is the Lisa from Temecula, which is I just think is hysterical because especially the first one, it's like anarchy, and everyone else kind of doesn't know what to make. Even the people that are sitting at the table don't know what to make of it. I also like some of the Julio Torres stuff, particularly. They did the thing Wells for Boys. I think it's hysterical. I like a lot of the pharmaceutical stuff, particularly sort of the Tina Fey years when the show is a little bit more feminist infused. They did like Mom Jeans, and there's like a really weird thing they did, which I don't even know how they got on the air, was the original Kotex. Just hysterical. I do like the Close Encounter sketch. I mean, Kate McKinnon is probably my favorite performer, of the last 20 years. As we always say when we watch the show together, that she's always so committed to what she's doing. I actually think the Black Jeopardy sketch is funny, and not just the Tom Hanks ones, but I've watched when I was doing the book. I watched all of them, and they're all very funny. Let me see, I'm going through my list here. Yeah, I think that's about it. My favorite old moment from the show is actually a mistake where Candice Bergen they're playing a thing about stupid people, and she calls Gilda Radner by the wrong name. And so it completely ruins the entire sketch. And that's one time that actually Gilda Radner kind of improvises, and it's very funny. You should watch it on YouTube. It's a very funny moment.
And my favorite, Gilda Radner was probably I mean, Kate McKinnon too, but Gilda Radner was probably my all-time favorite when she did Rosanna Dana. You know,
Top two.
she just, you know, there was Gilda Radner is such a perfect classic SNL performer in the sense that she's so likable that she can do this edgy stuff where she did, you know, the Judy Miller show. She's jumping on her bed, and the weird thing they never get on the air now with Buck Henry, with Uncle whatever he is, and he's taking these creepy pictures of this little girl. But it's Gilda Radner, you know, she just had the spirit that could make it work. So I think Kate McKinnon has a little of that, you know, in a different kind of way, right? Even when she's being nasty, it's not nasty.
Now, after the blue light pulled you into the spacecraft, what is your next memory?
I came to and saw a beautiful being made of like a beautiful calming light.
Yeah, same here. That being touched my head, and I felt every emotion in its purest form. It was amazing, and I cried, sir.
Okay, and you, Miss Rafferty?
Wow. What floor were you guys on? I woke up in a dirty metal dome, and 40 little gray aliens watched me pee in a steel bowl. When they took the bowl, walked out.
Interesting. Were these beings also bathed in light?
No. They were gray with big fat eyes, little mouths. They just stared while I peed. I don't think I was dealing with the top brass.
Ryan, you have about 800 listed. I'm gonna insist that you cut it by half.
And this list was much longer. So a couple of mine were taken already, like the Stefan and the Close Encounters ones. So those can be taken off the list. So one of my favorites, it's just one of those ones that I watched when I first watched it. I'm like, I can't believe they got away with this. Was Colonel Angus Comes Home. That's one of those ones. I love a good wordplay. I love innuendo. I think they got away with it because, as we like in the movie, they kind of show sometimes the censors don't even know what they're saying, so they can it flies under the radar. Colonel Angus is definitely one of those great ones where you can even tell where the audience doesn't quite understand what's going on, and I think that's what makes it great is when the audience is kind of like, "Is this supposed to be funny?" I'm like, "It is funny if you get it, you get it." And also, I think I love Christopher Walken, and also I am a Southern boy, so there's kind of the making fun of like the whole like Gone with the Wind type of thing just tickles me great.
Yeah, how they used to get away with getting stuff through the censors. They would put other stuff in the script that they knew would get cut.
Right.
It sort of takes the attention away from the other stuff, particularly. That's a very funny sketch.
Right. Two other ones real quick. I love Coconut Bangers Ball, Will Ferrell, Robert Goulet doing rap. My nickname in college was Big Papa because me and a friend of mine were drunk at a Waffle House with a bunch of like half our class, and we started doing Big Papa like Robert Goulet, and I, as a guy in college who was 6'3" and 250 pounds, Big Papa just kind of stuck. And then Stevie Nicks' Fajita Roundup, that's just such a great hidden gem of, I love Fleetwood Mac, and Lucy Lawless doing her as like doing Fleetwood Mac songs and Stevie Nicks songs, but about Mexican food, and I love Mexican food, so that's just great. And then some other ones, I love Japanese Game Show. I love the Bigfoot and Neil Diamond duet. Jingleheimer Junction is another one of those where I can't believe they got away with it. An Extra Christmas Carol with Jason Momoa has been like scrubbed from the internet. I don't know why. It's a Wonderful Life, Lost Ending. It's great. I love the Vincent Price holiday specials. I love the two name change office ones. And then Land Shark from, going back to the classics. I just, there's just some really good comedy in there. I
have to tell you something about Land Shark because I was there the first season. The Lily Tomlin show was in the second half of the first season, and they did Land Shark. And I think there's the one thing I remember is that it was nothing. It's this puppet on his hand, and it's just not even a real door. It's like a prop,
right?
Outline of a door, and it was still funny, but when I saw it in person, I thought, that's it. It was like being in college, and looking at like some silly sketch thing that you're doing in college, and it actually made the show even more charming for me.
You never saw Jaws, and you're afraid of sharks, so you probably didn't get the joke.
No, I didn't. I've never watched Jaws because I like going in the ocean, and to this day,
I just love that delivery, and the thing is, that's been done so many times now in other places where like he gets the name wrong. He's like, is Mr. Anderson there? Family Guy famously did the Brian on the as a call person's like, is Mr. Nagunian there? It's that I love that's for me, that's just great. That kind of it's like Candy Graham, like the shark knocked on the door and did not think at all of he didn't think it was going to get that far. I think it's kind of the joke in and of itself, which I think is great.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are mine.
Yes.
Mrs. Arlsberg?
Who?
Mrs. Baldwin?
Who is it?
Flowers?
Flowers for whom?
Plumber, ma'am.
I don't need a plumber. You're that clever shark, aren't you?
Candy Graham.
Candy Graham my foot. You get out of here before I call the police. You're the shark and you know it.
Wait, I'm only a dolphin, ma'am.
A dolphin? Well, okay.
I mean, I've always, Weekend Update has always been my favorite part of the show. I think there's enough variety in it where you get to have some of these one-off characters, it's a fun chance for people to kind of stretch something that may not be enough for a whole sketch. And then it's hard to pick a favorite. I mean, you guys have all named such great ones already, but I do think that, like Ryan said, so much of our shared language, because Ryan and I have been friends since high school, it's like we'll say stuff to each other where I don't even think of it as part of like SNL anymore. It's just something, that has been a repeated reference for the two of us for, however many years or decades at this point. So I do think that SNL is a huge part of our language. I know, if I'm looking up something on, if I want to go eat somewhere on Yelp, every once in a while I'll just do the Zagat's voice. Where, so that kind of stuff is fun to me too. But
the book is gone, but the mouth goes on. Yeah, some of the Chris Farley stuff is just great. I always appreciated Chris Farley as a bigger guy. Chris Farley, and right when Chris Farley just died when I was in middle school, and then Jack Black was becoming popular. I was like, oh, I have big guys I can look to. They were great North Stars for me to kind of look at. I'm like, okay, Chris Farley, Jack Black, that's
and then
good.
Celebrity Jeopardy as a recurring bit. I think that is probably where Ryan and I think,
yeah,
if those didn't exist, maybe 15% of our conversations just never happened.
Keanu Reeves has an impressive negative $32,000.
I know Kung Fu.
For the last time, no, you don't.
Of course, we like to end every episode with a book and a film recommendation. Film recommendation we'll do Saturday night, and then as well as the list of sketches. I don't see me adding all of these to the show notes, so I'll just encourage people to rewind or play at half speed.
But in the show notes, I do have even some of the more harder to find ones. I have them linked.
Okay,
so maybe
perfect.
Okay,
right.
the Bigfoot one is scrubbed from the internet because Neil Diamond hates it and is threatening to sue. Fajita Roundup has been scrubbed from the internet, and the Extra Christmas Carol have been scrubbed.
What's been scrubbed from the internet is the Axis of Evil sketch. Or at least you can find it on
Bush.
Yeah, like you can find it like on Daily Motion translated from like Portuguese or something, but it's not on YouTube at all because I was going to use it for a project. So it's definitely tricky to find that one too.
Yeah, I'm sure the Claudine Langer Invitational thing is scrubbed also, but nobody really understands that anymore. It's basically Claudine Langer shooting somebody, and they did a sketch of it. That crossed the line. Every
Yeah.
so often they cross the line, not often, but every so often. So,
But of course, the book that we're going to recommend is the SNL Companion, an unofficial guide to the seasons, sketches, and stars of Saturday Night Live, written by Steven Tropiano and Steven Ginsberg. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.